Hi all, thank you again for joining us for the South San Francisco General Plan Update process, and this is our first sub-area meeting. My name is Dave Jobby with Plan to Place. Before we get started, I just wanted to note we do have live interpretation in Spanish for this meeting, and that's what you see up on the screen, translated in Spanish for those that are dialing in or logging in. That would like to listen to this in Spanish. It has the option to actually pick that language as they dial in, and that's what's described here. And just so everyone has the opportunity to listen in the language that makes most sense for them. So with that, Eric, if you want to go to the next slide. Also, just wanted to give a quick heads up on how we're planning to facilitate the discussion today. As you probably all are pros now on Zoom, we're hoping to keep most of the discussion as a presentation is happening through the chat window, and we'll be gathering that input as we get it, and we'll be putting it on a virtual board that we'll share with you all as well. And then when we get to the Q&A portions, which it's broken up in many different portions to do that, including a couple live polls, we can also use the hand raise function that you see there, and that's simply going to the bottom of your screen. A little blue hand will pop up, and that'll let me know that you have a verbal comment you'd like to make, and I could unmute you if you aren't able to unmute yourself, and we can have you provide that input then. And if you're calling in, you could simply dial *9. That gives you that same option. So with that, I think we're going to roll right into the presentation, and Eric will give you an overview of the agenda and how we're hoping this meeting to go, and we're looking forward to having a lively discussion. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Eric.
Thanks, Dave. Let me get my slides going. Thanks. And thanks everyone for coming tonight. We really appreciate you all and your continued interest in the general plan update. This is really the second set of sub-area meetings that we've done on the general plan update. We did our first round back in September, August and September of 2019. And this is really an opportunity to reflect back on some of what we've heard in those meetings and to start this conversation about land use alternatives in South San Francisco. You know, the general plan itself is really this great opportunity for all of us to come together and talk about all the issues that matter the most to us, whether it's housing, whether it's business and economic development, whether it's parks and open space, whether it's social equity. So we're going to have an opportunity to talk about those issues tonight within the context of the East of 101 planning sub-area and within this question of land use alternatives for the area. Tonight I'm going to, or this afternoon I should say, I'm going to give a brief background and set of slides on the East of 101 area and the land use alternatives. And through that process, we're going to do a series of polls, which we're going to launch one here in just a minute to learn a little bit more about who is in the room and participating with us this afternoon. And then we're going to do this like we would traditionally do a workshop in person. We're going to have breakout rooms in Zoom, and we're going to do small group discussions and launch a survey so you can give us more feedback on those land use alternatives. And then we will wrap up and do a bit of a report back and a brief kind of next steps so you all can hear about the other upcoming meetings that are going on. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dave to launch us into a poll because we want to know a little bit about who is participating this afternoon.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, so you all should see a poll that popped up on your screen. Just kind of getting a sense of demographics of those that have joined us here today. So if you can please, hopefully you can access that. You should be able to access that now. There we go. I see it populating. We'll give you all a quick minute here. And then when I end the poll, you'll actually see the results pop up on your screen. Always fun to get a sense of who's joining us, what neighborhood you're from before we get started. So I'll give you maybe another 10 seconds here. Looks like short of city staff and the consultant team, we have about 30 folks that have joined us today, which is great. So thank you so much for your time. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now, and we could share the results so you can all see it. Looks like a fairly good mix joining us here today from different areas throughout the city. Obviously, east of 101 may be most represented, which makes sense since that's the focus of the discussion today. So thank you for that. I won't waste any more time on that, and we'll move forward with the presentation. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dave. So really tonight, the purpose of the presentation that I'm going to give and the purpose of the meeting is really to kind of give you a sense of where we are in the overall Shape SSF process, and then really kind of review and solicit input and feedback on these land use alternatives for the east of 101 planning sub-area. So many of you might be asking what Shape SSF is if you haven't participated in the past. But it's really the update of the city's general plan, climate action plan, zoning code, and then environmental impact report. The general plan really allows us to kind of create a long-term policy document to guide the future actions of South San Francisco. That includes future policy choices and decisions that a city might make, but also future development applications as well. The general plan process itself really allows the community to come together to create a shared vision for the future, which we've been doing really over the last 6 or 7 months, and we presented last Tuesday evening at the Citywide Alternatives Workshop. The general plan also gives us this great opportunity to really kind of enhance those core community assets and strengths that are there throughout the city or in specific sub-areas of the city, and then to address new areas of concern and new topics that are important, such as healthy communities, climate change, social equity, and environmental justice. The general plan itself doesn't rest alone. It really stands on the shoulders of all this other work that's been done over the last 10 years or so in South San Francisco. This is just a very small selection of the work that's been done both by the community and by city staff and decision makers. And it's our job as a team really to lift up the key themes, ideas, and elements within all of these plans and really bring them into the general plan update itself. Really, that's things like the projects that are part of those, the kind of the key policy ideas that are embedded within those, and really bring those into the general plan update. This diagram shows where we are in the Shape SSF process. We are now in the phase where we're going to be reviewing and discussing land use alternatives. Back in last year, we did a deep exploration around existing conditions, both quantitatively doing data analysis, but also qualitatively going out and meeting community members, businesses to really hear about what some of those issues and opportunities are within the city. That really launched this process to develop those vision and guiding principles, which you can find on our website as well, and in the last workshop that we did at the citywide scale. Once we finish this process to do land use alternatives, they will be developing a final land use plan, and that'll kind of launch us into the development of very specific policy frameworks that will be the kind of the core chapters of the general plan. We intend to publish the draft of the general plan in 2021 with subsequent releases of the EIR and zoning code and climate action plan to follow. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of what land use alternatives are. These land use alternatives really test different land use and urban design patterns so that we can explore different policy questions that we might have both citywide and then in smaller sub areas within South San Francisco. So these are things like, what's the right balance and mix of industrial lands to kind of tech, biotech, and office lands so that we can maintain South San Francisco as an economic engine for the region. So how do we produce housing that's affordable to a variety of households and family types in South San Francisco? How do we do that? Where do we do that? So these alternatives allow us to test these different trade-offs between different land use patterns within the city so that we can really make more informed choices about future direction. When we talk about these land use alternatives, which we're going to show in a little while, you're going to see these colorful maps that really look at kind of three kind of key things. The first is the pattern of land uses. So it's kind of the distribution of residential to commercial to mixed uses kind of across the entire city and then within each of the sub areas themselves. And then within smaller areas, we're really focused on the mix of those uses. So some of the areas will be colored purple, and those will have those might have a mix of commercial uses, residential uses, and then office R&D uses as well. And then the alternatives also show this relative intensity of land use, so kind of a gradient from high to lower intensity. We bring all that together, and we've established a few evaluation criteria looking at the balance of jobs and housing, how people travel across the city, and its implications for greenhouse gas emissions. Each of those land use maps that you'll see later really are built on these building blocks that we call place types. These are the kind of the uses and the intensities of the land and kind of the form and character of what that might look like in the future. So some of those building blocks include residential types, like you can see on the left-hand side with the residential medium. It includes some commercial type, like business and technology park. And it includes mixed-use types that have sometimes a mix of retail and services with residential or office over top of them or next to them on the same parcel. Those three are all types of building blocks that already all exist in South San Francisco, and there are many of the building blocks that you'll recognize as already happening within South San Francisco. But there are some other building blocks that we're going to talk about tonight, like mixed industrial high, which would be a new type for South San Francisco and reflects larger regional and national trends about development of industrial spaces. So we're currently in the process of moving from alternatives to zoning into the future. So at this point in time, we have these three alternatives that we're going to be talking to you about today. We're also doing a series of other sub-area meetings in downtown Lindenville and also El Camino over the next couple of weeks. We're going to take all that information that we get from all of these workshops and then pull it all together and create one final general plan land use map. That general plan land use map will then be the basis to create the more detailed zoning designations that you maybe are all familiar with. And those zoning designations will have things such as the bulk of the buildings, the allowable heights, more detailed lists of land uses, and the proportions of open space and parking that are required on every parcel. So really where that development, those development standards live. When we create the alternatives, we start with a series of background analysis. For East of 101, we really recognize that this area is kind of the easternmost edge of the city. It runs along the bay, along its eastern edge. And it's really an economic engine for the city with over 30,000 jobs, with a strong mix of office, R&D, and industrial land uses out in the area. There's also a series of public uses out in the area, such as the Oyster Point Park, and then the water quality control plant or some of those other public uses that are in the area. This map and graphic show the land use distribution within the East of 101 area. And so this area is really bound by the 101 freeway here. You can see the kind of the light brown is the office research and development and kind of those biotech and life science uses. The gray is more of an industrial use, and in a lot of cases, those might be things like logistics and warehousing. And then also you see the darker gray, which is a mix of things like transportation. So Samtrans has a large facility out in the East of 101, as does the water quality control plant. So those are in those darker grays. You also see some of this red, particularly along South Airport Boulevard and the 101 freeway. Those are a mix of commercial uses. So from big box uses like Costco and Lowe's, but also some of those hotels along the Airport Boulevard. And so it's split pretty evenly between those three uses east of 101. As I mentioned, there's over 30,000 jobs in the East of 101 area. And this is a snapshot from 2018 in terms of the total jobs and their composition east of 101. I think we all recognize that the conditions are a little different than they were back in 2018 when these data were compiled from. But you can really see that East of 101 has about 60% of the jobs within South San Francisco, with a significant number of those, and over half of them in professional services, information, manufacturing, and about 15% of those in transportation and warehousing. During our sub-area meetings and our quantitative analysis of the existing conditions in the East of 101 area, we started to identify kind of this broad set of issues that are out there already within the planning sub-area that we want to start to address through this planning process and then moving forward into the general plan process. So we heard that traffic congestion was really bad at the gateways where those entry points are, in particular, into the east of 101 area. We heard that there's significant pressure to convert some of those existing industrial uses in the area to life sciences or biotech uses or office uses within the district. We also know through our technical analysis that there's a number of environmental pollutants, whether it's the Highway 101 corridor, which has mobile sources of emissions, or more stationary sources of emissions like the Oyster Point landfill. And we also know that there's issues that are likely to be an issue in the future, such as the sea level rise and flooding, which you can see on the map here in light blue in this area. We heard a lot about there's not enough daily services and amenities in the area, and that there's limited non-automobile transportation within this area. Now, we're gonna launch a little poll right now to kind of talk about and have you kind of weigh in on what you think some of those priority issues are in the east of 101 area, so we can get a sense. We have all these issues, so what are the most important ones of those issues for us to address in the future? So the poll is now up on the screen, so please take a moment to kind of fill in this poll.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, you all should see that now on your screen. I see it populating here pretty quickly, so we'll give it maybe another 10-15 seconds here. A 5-second countdown. If anyone else wants to get in. Okay. So I'm going to share the results here so you all could see it on your screen as well. It looks like traffic congestion, as maybe could be anticipated, has taken lead here, followed closely by lack of daily amenities, lack of housing, sea level rise and flooding, a good distribution of potential key issues. So definitely very telling, and limited pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure also has weighed in. So thank you for that information, really helpful, and we could definitely dive into this even deeper when we get into our small groups, but that's great to get a sense of the room. So thanks for that. And Eric, I'll hand it.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I think it is interesting that nobody selected business displacement or limited access to the Bay, but thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. And so part of us recognizing and understanding what's happening in East of 101, we go and we look at the current policy environment that's already out there right now. And this image and set of bullets really reflects what the current policy is from the city's general plan, which was originally adopted in 1999, but was updated again as recently as 2015. You can see that here at the Caltrain area, there's this idea of kind of creating this transit-oriented commercial core right next to the Caltrain station. And then up north along the 101 corridor, up to Oyster Point Boulevard, in particular along the freeway corridor of the 101, kind of like a place for commercial uses, but then also a place for higher intensity life sciences and biotech in that kind of pink area. This darker brown area shows that kind of core of life sciences, biotech, office uses within the East of 101 area. And then south of East Grand down here, where you can see Harbor and Utah Avenue in particular, there's this core focus on industrial uses and preserving those industrial uses here within the East of 101 area. And then south along Airport Boulevard, you can kind of see this mixed commercial pattern. Now, this is the policy environment that's currently established as part of the general plan update. Now, if you remember back, it's not exactly the same as the existing land use because the policy sets the vision out for the future of the area, whereas the existing land use tells you what's there today. So they're a little bit different in those two things. We also looked at the overall market conditions within South San Francisco and each of the sub-areas across the city. And we know that biotechnology and life sciences are likely to continue to be a primary driver of development within the city going forward into the future. We also know that over time, there's been a reduction in the production, distribution, and repair facilities and jobs within South San Francisco. And those are often what we call more broadly as industrial uses. And so over the last 10 years or so, we've seen a decline in the proportion of those jobs within South San Francisco, but it's still about 20 to 25% of the city's job base are within those PDR types of jobs. There's also opportunities to increase both hospitality and retail uses moving forward in the future. With retail in particular, that will be really linked to the incremental growth in households and workers over time. The impacts of COVID-19 are still not fully known and won't be for some time. We know that there's unprecedented unemployment rates within the country as a whole, within our region, and then within South San Francisco, where there's about a 14% unemployment rate. We also know there's been diminished demand for things like retail and hospitality uses in particular, and that's really compromised the fiscal health of a lot of the communities, not just South San Francisco, but all around the Bay Area and California as a whole. But South San Francisco has a lot of competitive assets that it really can build from. And when we think about economic recovery moving into the future, into kind of what's that long-term vision for economic growth in the city, we'll be thinking about how to build on those existing assets within the community. Finally, what we don't really know about is kind of the length of time that the economic and market conditions will be like this moving forward. We don't know if this is a recession or a longer depression, and that will both take shape over the next few months and even years. And then we've also changed a lot of our social behaviors over the last few months. We travel differently than we did before. We work differently than before. So it's uncertain exactly how those will change over time. And so we'll be thinking about that in the general plan process as well. We also, when doing our technical analysis, looked at kind of the housing conditions within the region and then within South San Francisco as a whole. And we know that there's been strong demand for housing. Over the last about 5 years, the city has permitted about 1,000 housing units, so 977,000 housing units, or 977 housing units over the last about 5 years. But the state and the region asks each community to accommodate a certain amount of housing within their housing elements. And so the city of South San Francisco has accommodated about a half of what's been asked of them to accommodate in their regional housing needs assessment and their housing element by 2023. So that's that 1,864 units. We also know, though, that there are a number of housing projects which are in the pipeline and will produce more housing for the city within this time horizon. That's kind of where we are, the snapshot of where we are now. But what we've heard is that the region now is undergoing its new regional housing needs assessment. And what we've heard from the folks who are working on in the methodology group there, that each city in the region should expect to have to accommodate between 2 and 4 times more housing than under their current regional housing needs assessment. So for South San Francisco, that would be 3,700 to 4,700 units by 2030. And so when we're thinking about the general plan, we're not just thinking about that 8-year period and that next regional housing needs assessment cycle, but we're thinking about a much longer time scale out to 2040, 2045. And so we're looking at kind of a cone of about 11,000 to 22,000 housing units that the general plan would kind of find opportunities and sites for within the city. So now the land use alternatives for the east of 101 area. Before we get to them, we wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the proposed vision and kind of high-level guiding policy for the east of 101 area. And we're going to stop here and kind of take a temperature check poll on what you think about this proposed vision and policy for the area. So overall, the vision for this area is kind of as a well-connected innovation district with a diverse mix of uses that serves as a model of sustainability, resilience, and economic opportunity. As part of that vision, we've started to develop some guiding policy based on what we've heard in our conversations with community members and decision makers. These include sort of preserving that cluster of life sciences as an economic engine for the city. We're kind of allowing new and emerging technologies and industries to come into the East of 101 area to really maintain a well-connected district. And that means things like walking, biking, transit use, but also things like high technology, so fiber networks, so that those businesses can thrive out in the East of 101 area. We also want to make sure that as an innovation district, this creates places for people to interact and gather. So meeting places, whether they're kind of commercial places or open spaces where people can come together and meet within the district. And then we also want to make sure that we kind of diversify the mix of uses in the district. As we saw earlier, there are only about three primary land uses out within the area. So we're looking at kind of creating a more diverse set of mix of uses in the East of 101 area. We also want to make sure to center the building of resilience to sea level rise and really connecting people and nature to the bay. And then finally, the East of 101 area is full of really creative and thoughtful businesses and individuals, and we want to really kind of harness them to help us create the solutions for all of these complex challenges that already exist in East of 101 and will be there in the future. And so with that, I'm going to launch a little bit of we're going to launch a poll to just do a temperature check and to see if you kind of agree with this updated vision for the East of 101 area. So asking if you strongly agree down to strongly disagree, kind of in a gradient. So we'll give you just a quick second to review the question and answer it.
Great, thanks, Eric. Populating here pretty quickly. We'll wait here a few more seconds. And again, we'll have plenty of opportunity to dive into this as well when we get into the small groups, but this is an opportunity, as Eric mentioned, to get a quick gut reaction on what you've heard here. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now and share those results. Looks like in general, from those that took the poll, that there is agreement that what you've heard for the vision for East 101 is fairly accurate. And again, we'll have an opportunity to dive into this deeper here shortly. So thank you. Eric, back to you.
Thanks, Dave. So two things specifically we want to point out before we get to the alternatives is that, one, there's been a lot of work done on the East of 101 Mobility 2020 plan. We see this process as really integrating the core components of that in terms of those improvements to biking, transit, pedestrian ways, as well as roadways in the East of 101 area. And then second, we also want to recognize that a lot of work has been done around Coma Creek adaptation planning in particular, and you're going to see that kind of weaved into the alternatives themselves. And there's really kind of focused around three guiding principles. One is managing water, moving through the Coma Creek corridor, that's stormwater that comes through. Two, kind of reintroducing nature and natural features into that creek corridor. And three, really improving access for people to the creek itself and then along the creek corridor itself. So those are, when we talk about the transformation of Coma Creek, we're really talking about those particular ideas. And so in the alternatives for the East of 101 area, we really tested this series of like 7 big ideas. And I'll just focus on the top ones and we'll get to the alternatives quickly. The first is really kind of creating a mixed-use transit-oriented community adjacent to the Caltrain station. We're thinking a little bit more broadly about transit orientation, and we used to talk a lot about transit-oriented development, but we're trying to talk a little bit more about a transit-oriented community. So that's not just putting density right at the transit station, but really thinking about beyond just those land use and development policies, thinking about the mobility that happens around the transit station itself. So how do people access the station? How do people move around the district? How do people get from the neighborhoods from downtown into the other areas of East of 101? But then also we want to think about how that can support other goals around sustainability and social equity. The second idea we're really trying to test in the alternatives is adding housing east of 101. So currently there is no housing in the east of 101 area, and we've allowed these three alternatives to test kind of three ideas. So the scale of that and where that residential happens is shown on those different alternatives. And this is really to meet those broader goals that the city has around housing production within South San Francisco. The third idea that we're really testing is really this future of the employment areas in the east of 101 area and what happens particularly in the mixed industrial areas. So you'll see alternatives where we allow the intensification of industrial and alternatives where we allow biotechnology and life sciences to move south into that, what space is currently industrial areas. And then we also really test like looking at South Airport Boulevard as a corridor, as a mixed-use corridor that supports pedestrian and cyclist activity as well as transit and good walkability. And you'll see across all of the alternatives too, opportunities to improve connectivity, reconnecting into Colma Creek, and then thinking about addressing sea level rise overall. So as I mentioned before, the alternatives are really built with a series of building blocks. And so on the maps, you're going to see a series of these different, what we call place types. And so we just wanted to show you some of the images for what those look like. This is the urban mixed-use transit core. This would be really right there adjacent to the Caltrain station. As we kind of move away from that, we've looked at a kind of a high intensity mixed-use type that kind of gradiates away from that Caltrain station. Same with a kind of a medium intensity mixed use that would move a little bit further away from that Caltrain station and south along Airport Boulevard. And then even a lower intensity mixed use that you might see on South Airport Boulevard. In addition to those mixed use types, there's a series of commercial types. So this is Business and Technology Park High. This is actually not a type that exists out in the east of 101 area, but this would allow intensification of some of those office, R&D, and life sciences companies in the future. And then this is the kind of the current model of what's happening out in the east of 101 in terms of those office life science buildings. We also have a different typology, as I mentioned earlier, called Mixed Industrial High, which allows the intensification of that current industrial area and some of the alternatives. So it would sort of double the allowable density that you would have on those sites so that they could improve over time. And now the alternatives themselves. So this is the first alternative, alternative one. This alternative really tests and shows kind of the testing of a smaller mixed-use transit-oriented community right here at the Caltrain station in this dark purple. This is the kind of the smallest of those mixed-use cores right here at the Caltrain station. It also, in the kind of the northern section, kind of maintains and allows that kind of office, biotechnology, and life sciences fabric to continue into the future at its sort of the same intensity that it's allowed currently right now. What this alternative does also test, though, is this idea of allowing those types of uses, so those office, life science uses, to move down into this area in the southern portion of the east of 101 area. So Harbor Way and Utah area down here in the southern section here. And that really maintains, as you can see, that sort of maintains South Airport as a kind of a mixed commercial corridor, like it is today. Alternative 2 really expands the idea of what this mixed-use transit-oriented community is at the Caltrain station. It expands it both here at the station and allows some intensification, but allows it to move north along the 101 corridor, and then south also along Airport Boulevard, and really kind of creating that sort of mixed-use corridor along South Airport Boulevard, all the way down to Colma Creek to really capitalize on that investment in Colma Creek. This alternative largely maintains that core area of industrial uses south of the East Grand area, this kind of gray area here, and it allows it really to intensify over time. So it allows those properties to improve over time and not sort of stay the same over time. And since we sort of constrained the life sciences office uses in terms of the land area, we've allowed in this kind of northern section of the area to allow them to intensify over time. So they kind of keep that same physical footprint and form, but they allow them to go a little higher so those uses can continue to grow in the east of 101 area. And then finally, this is alternative number 3. And you can see here we've kind of maintained this core of around the mixed-use transit-oriented community around the Caltrain station, allowed it again to intensify, and then allowed it to kind of those uses to move further south along Airport Boulevard in a kind of a more intense pattern. Like alternative 2, it kind of maintains the footprint of the office, biotech and life sciences uses up here in the northern section of the area, but allows them to intensify, and likewise kind of keeps this footprint of the life sciences here in the southern portion of the site south of East Grand Avenue, and allows those to intensify over time. Now, I want to just point out, I'm going to put all 3 up there at the same time so you can look across all 3 alternatives at the same time and see them. And the notes are sort of the same as on all of the boards from the previous slides. So I want to just mention one question about sea level rise that's come up, and that I can show you on all 3 of these alternatives. I think in all cases, we assume that improvements would be made to mitigate the impacts of coastal flooding and sea level rise in the east of 101 area. That's going to include and require a lot of different activities to make that happen. It might include nature-based solutions like green infrastructure to mitigate water from storms. It might include things like gray infrastructure, which includes things like seawalls along the edge of the land. It might include regulatory measures like improving when properties are improved and people want to redevelop their land. They might need to raise the base floor elevation of their properties. And it could include things like financial mechanisms to help pay for all of those different improvements. That would be in addition to other outside sources of funding to improve for those sea level rise improvements. So it's important to recognize in all of these alternatives, we've kind of assumed that through a series of different types of measures, we would kind of maintain the footprint of the east of 101 area. And then on all of the alternatives, you'll have seen a series of dotted lines, dashed lines, that really show some of the mobility improvements that are drawn on the maps. And this is just a selection of some of those, the Caltrain underpass, Coma Creek Bikeway, the 380 extension. So all of those are kind of incorporated into all of the alternatives. And we sort of held those constant throughout all of the alternatives because they're important for each of those different alternatives. So this screen just has a lot of text on it, but it really shows and describes some of those key opportunities and challenges that we're starting to think about and talk about, and we'd like you to think about today as well during your small group discussions. So some of those opportunities out here in the East of 101 area, it's a really unique opportunity to create an innovation district with a mix of uses, high-tech companies, open space, nature. There's a real opportunity there. Second, there is a real opportunity. It's a big area, an opportunity to address some of the local housing crisis with the building of the production of housing in the East of 101 area. That housing and those new jobs can really help support Caltrain ridership in the future when services come back over time, and really creating kind of that mixed-use, vibrant mixed-use station area that is a kind of a hub of activity and a place for people to gather in the future. So those are real opportunities in the East of 101 area. Some of those challenges we've already talked about, like include sea level rise and Coma Creek flooding. There's a potential to displace commercial and industrial businesses. There are issues with the allowable heights in certain areas of East of 101 because of the SFO and its flight patterns. And as we mentioned, as one of the biggest issues already, this traffic congestion at the gateways. So putting more development in the area would have an effect on that traffic congestion that's already bad today. So those are some of those kind of opportunities and challenges that we've been thinking about with those alternatives. And so I am going to pause here. We're going to launch our next poll. And it's really to get a sense from you, kind of on a gut level, what you think about those three different alternatives for the area, and what you think is most important in terms of, and how important you think it is to balance future jobs and housing. We're going to have an opportunity to really discuss these issues in a lot more detail in the breakout groups, which we're going to do in just a moment. But for now, we'll go ahead and give you an opportunity to fill in this poll. And then we're also going to take some questions from you. So if you have questions, as Dave mentioned earlier, please feel free to drop them in the chat for us. You can raise your hand as a participant and raise your hand, and we'll allow you to unmute yourself and ask us a few questions before we move to those breakout groups.
Great, thanks, Eric. I see a few coming in. I'm going to wait maybe 5 more seconds here, give you all an opportunity to read through and provide us your input on the alternatives. And then, as Eric mentioned, we're going to be transitioning to the small group, and just want to give a quick heads up, and I'll let you know again, it's going to take us a few minutes to do that distribution. We're probably going to break out into about 5 groups. And then I'm going to go ahead and just randomly distribute folks into those groups. You'll see something pop up on your screen asking you to enter that small group, and then you'll have a facilitator at each one of those to help guide you through that discussion. And then we'll come back afterwards and do a quick report out on some of those key themes that we heard in those groups. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll.
Dave, as you're doing that, I just want to clarify that the poll is for members of the public to vote, and that staff and the consultant teams are not voting on the polls.
Thank you for that, Lisa. Yeah, good reminder. Thank you. Eric, do you want to walk them quickly through the results while I start setting up these breakout rooms?
You got it, Dave. So overall, there was kind of a mix of support for each of the different alternatives, but generally support for a different vision for the east of 101 area. There was a mix of them with a kind of the most support. About half of the respondents liked alternative number 3, but about a third of them liked alternative number 1. And then we asked about how important it was to you to balance future jobs and housing, and about 75% of you said it was either very important or extremely important to balance jobs and housing in the Eastern 101 area. So obviously very important to do that as well. And you can see that in the selection of the different alternatives, which do all add some housing into the Eastern 101 area. I'm not seeing any questions within the chat or raised hands from participants. So I think we will start. Dave's going to move us all out into the breakout groups. I am just going to kind of move through and just show you, these are the discussion questions that we're going to be talking specifically about in the breakout rooms. So we're going to ask you about each of those 3 alternatives, what you like and dislike about them. And we're going to ask you what your preferred alternative is for the area. And then we're going to ask a little bit about some of the priority improvements or strategies that you'd like to see. And those could be things related to economic development, parks and open space, housing, whatever kind of strategies you want to do. And then at the conclusion of our small group discussion, we're going to ask that you go and fill out this online survey to provide us some additional information and your kind of thoughts about which alternative you prefer. So with that, I think we're ready to break out.
So what I'm hoping to do here is we'll just do kind of a quick speed round, trying to get a sense of what each one of the small groups spoke about. And I was envisioning we don't necessarily need to go through each question, but just really highlighting some of the key themes that might be relevant to any one of the alternatives. If you found that folks gravitated towards one, that would be great to know as well. But just what some of the preferences were, priorities are, as we continue to kind of move forward toward a preferred alternative. So with that, I'm just going to go down names here, and I'm going to ask each one of the meeting facilitators or small group facilitators to give us a quick 1-minute synopsis of their discussion. And then we'll do a couple wrap-up items and let you all go about your day. So with that, Eric, do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So our group had a preference for alternatives number 2 and number 3 overall, kind of a strong, kind of a directionally more folks gravitated towards alternative number 3. They saw alternative 1 as really kind of maintaining the status quo more or less out in the area, but really thinking about alternatives 2 and 3 as a way to create interesting and new change in east of 101. There's a lot of conversation in our group, if there is housing production in the east of 101 area, making sure that there's enough services, infrastructure, retail, open space to kind of meet the needs of those future residents within the district, as well as those for current employees. We also talked a little bit about expanding the transit network in the east of 101 area, everything from ferry service to transit into the district, and then also really leveraging and thinking about how we can use open space as a way to use nature-based solutions to adapt to climate change in the future.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Eric. I have a feeling there was a lot of familiarity between groups. We had a lot of similar discussion. Diana, would you like to give us a quick highlight of what your group talked about? And you're currently on mute. I think we all mute as we come back.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, so my group was actually a little different preference for alternative 1. It was more for biotech to grow through the area. And there was a particular appreciation of the concentration of urban transit around Caltrain, high density urban transit, whereas in the other alternatives, it wasn't as strong directly around Caltrain. And so my group pretty much looked at this and said, this is a better starting point, and we just add a little bit more housing. Even going south, going east, and some, you'd ask a few questions revisiting why isn't there housing around Oyster Point, an appreciation of the Utah overpass as well as the estuary bridge, because that will to ease congestion. Wanting to make sure that there is public open space throughout the whole area, particularly.
Great. Thank you so much, Diana. That's great. Thank you. Rosemary, you want to Rochambeau for who does our group? I guess I'll do it since I'm unmuted. So our group, we didn't necessarily gravitate toward any one alternative. There was definitely conversation about higher densities around Caltrain making sense throughout, but then we also talked a lot about balancing that out with appropriate amenities, ensuring that we have the right amount of open space and access for all to that open space, addressing things like what traffic congestion and and access for emergency vehicles and access for emergency in general as this area grows, and whether that means kind of spreading out some of that growth or if it's a higher pockets. There was conversation about how residential and office and R&D could coexist, and making sure that that balance is looked at closely. And then just connectivity between city activity centers as well was an area of interest for folks. But in general, I think people saw parts of each one of the alternatives that could work, recognizing that the final preferred alternative might be a mix of different elements of each. So otherwise, I think a lot of the other things that were spoken to were definitely very relevant in our group as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Patricia to give us a highlight of her group. Or I can't remember which group you ended up in, or whoever.
I ended up in Eric's room, so he's already.
Oh, you were in Eric's room. Okay, never mind. So Megan, you were also in Eric's room. We did a huge scramble, by the way, at the beginning, so we all ended up in different rooms. We have definitely 2 groups left. Megan, were you in one of them? Oh, we have 1 group left. What was that?
Troy's room.
Troy.
Yeah.
Troy, you are up.
Great. We were group number 5, but sounds like we're group number 4. We heard a slight preference or a preference for alternative number 2. The reasoning being that it kept a lot of the diversity of the existing industrial and office while introducing a aggressive but not overwhelming amount of residential. There was support for the new connections into and out of east of 101. There were some questions about the phasing and sort of the time frame for all this happening, and thinking about that we're communicating that this is a long-term process. Questions about the potential impacts of sea level rise and how that will be an issue around the Utah area. And yeah, strong support for the developments and the evolution of the South Airport Boulevard area to try and take advantage of some of those underutilized areas.
Great. Thank you, Troy. I think that takes us through all the rooms. We did have a little bit of a scramble where folks are popping in and out of rooms, or they kind of showed up a little late. So thank you for your patience for those that got moved around a bit as we started. But that was excellent. Thank you for your patience as we work through that. I think that was some great discussion and will help move us forward. With that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Eric, if you want to give us a couple wrap-ups and what's to come, and we'll take it from there. Thanks again.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm just gonna do another screen share very quickly. I just want to let you all know that if you go to shapessf.net/alternatives, you'll find a whole web page devoted to the land use alternatives, from citywide alternatives to sub-area alternatives. This includes the presentations, the recordings from the past events that we've done already, some primer videos, and then very specifically links to surveys that we hope that you'll take both at the citywide scale and then for each of the planning sub-areas. In particular, those are both in English and in Spanish for folks to take those different surveys. And I know in our group, in everyone's group, we did the East of 101, but there are these other surveys for downtown, El Camino, Lindenville, and then also citywide. So we encourage you to take all of those. We have a series of, we're in this kind of larger process of doing these meetings. We kicked it off last week on the 14th with the citywide workshop. Did a planning commission meeting last Thursday on the alternatives. Today was obviously the Eastern 101 meeting that we're in now, but we have a couple upcoming ones that we encourage you to participate in. So the downtown sub area, Lindenville, and then El Camino. And the downtown sub area particularly is tonight at 6 p.m. It's the same information that you logged in to this Zoom meeting with for that as well this evening. And then we'll be going to a joint study session of City Council and Planning Commission on August 19th, where we summarize a lot of what we've heard, both in the discussions at these meetings, but then also in those surveys that folks have been filling out. And then finally, I'll leave you with this one last slide. It's please go to shapessf.net. There's a lot of great information on the project, how to get involved, background resources, and all this information on the surveys. We encourage you to share this with your friends and colleagues. So we want to get as many people to participate in the process as possible. And then we're going to do a quick poll before we get out of here tonight, just to know a little bit about how you heard about the meeting and how you got looped into the process, so that we know what's being effective in terms of our communication moving forward, and then also whether or not you participated in a previous Shape SSF event. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming this evening or this afternoon. I know it's a couple hours out in the middle of your day, so we appreciate your time today. We look forward to hearing more from you and seeing you at upcoming meetings. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, as Eric mentioned, we're just going to put up a couple last polls. This first one is just to get a sense of what other meetings you've had an opportunity to attend to this point. I'm just going to leave this up for a few more seconds. Looks like we might be losing interest in poll taking. We appreciate your time. I'm going to go ahead and end this one in a couple of seconds here. Looks like a good mix. I might just give a quick synopsis instead of sharing it out. Looks like we've had about a handful of folks at sub-area meetings, a few, 2 to 3 folks at the workshops, one at pop-up events, and a couple taking polls. And I also wanted to ask just real quick how you found out about the event. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that one. If you can please let us know, we're always trying to fine tune our approach as to how you hear about these events and how you'd like to hear about these events, what's most efficient for you all. Looks like the mailer and emails were pretty popular. I'll leave this up for a few more seconds here if you have an opportunity to take that. Okay, maybe 5 more seconds. All right, great. Looks like emails were very popular in terms of the easiest way to reach you all, with which we anticipated, but I hope you did receive the mailer as well, and that was a nice reminder. I'll go ahead and end the poll now. And if there are any other questions or comments that you all had, I'll go ahead and share this one out real quick so we have that result. Please let us know now, or just as Eric mentioned with the website noted here, all the information will be posted to the project website, including the recording of this meeting and the summary of this meeting and all the future meetings coming up. So again, we very much appreciate your time and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much. Take care all.
Thanks, everyone.